And
Yeah.
we're talking about traditions and Wakayama with Todd Van Horne. So stick around. We'll be right back. Maybe. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I have Todd Van Horne today with me talking about Umeshu and Umeboshi and all things Ume. Now, Todd, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation. Happy to be here.
It's awesome. We've talked about sake, we've talked about shochu, and now we get to talk about umeshu. I'm so excited. I'm such a fan. And look, I'm even drinking, it's not
Ooh.
umeshu, but it's Ume Juice, which I
Oh,
make
nice.
every year. Yeah,
What do you?
I do. We have a tree. I have a funny story. Can I tell you? We have
Please.
a tree when we bought this house and we remodeled an old house, and
Hmm.
it just looked like a tree was like not ever going to have any leaves or any flowers. It was just a stump, but it was a pretty stump, so I kept it. And then after a couple years of living here, I kept trimming it and putting fertilizer or compost around. And suddenly beautiful white flowers started coming out and I was really excited. And then the
Wow.
fruit came out and I was really
Yeah.
excited, and I wasn't exactly sure what kind of fruit it was, and I tried to
Yeah.
eat some and I got really sick.
Mm. Yeah.
And then my neighbor, who was also babysitting for us, she said, "No, that's ume. You can't eat it. You have to salt it. You have to pickle it. You have to make umeshu." And she taught
Yeah.
me. So that's such a great story.
Oh,
And
so cool.
it only occasionally has fruit, but I love having an ume
Mm.
tree in my garden. It's wonderful.
Oh, nice. You get the blossoms every year.
Not every year, but
Okay.
yeah, every other
Okay.
year or something. How did
Huh.
you start your love of ume? Where did that come from?
Yeah. Well, let's see. I came to Japan, and at one point I had a restaurant. I was very into foods. Um, so cooking for the customers, of course, but also producing various foodstuffs. I had a line of Koji-based items like Shio Koji, had some handmade furikake, stuff like that for sale at the local grocery stores and at local events. Um, and a friend just called and he said, "Hey, my neighbor is a retired uh, manager from this company. And we were discussing and thought he might introduce you." And so I was in Japan's largest ume producing company for 4 years.
Wow, that's really interesting. Well,
Yeah.
let's talk a bit about the history of Ume, or what you
Yeah.
know about the area. And
Yes.
I read that Umeboshi or Ume is has a 1,300 year history. Is that right?
Well, I think if you're talking about history, I think many things in Japan will be considered to have a 1300-year history because that's when the first writings were left. Ume seeds have been found in archaeological digs 2,000 and more years ago. Um, Common wisdom says they were brought from China, although being the same, general geographical area, I wonder if they weren't always here. But as with a lot of fruit, the first varieties of ume were hardly edible. I mean, they're hardly edible now. You can imagine how it was then. Um, and so, they're a product of years of cultivation, just like every fruit. So yeah,
I
like you
often
said,
see that it's described as plum, and then other areas it'll
yes.
say it's an apricot, and it's actually
Mm,
its own fruit. So when
mm,
I see it used in abroad, it's usually ume, Japanese ume.
mm,
It's not really used like plum or anything. Is that
yeah.
right?
Yeah, personally, my hope is that ume would be referred to as ume, and people might come to understand what that means and that it's separate from, you know, or that Japanese plum is not accurate. So ume is a stone fruit. It's related to the plum and the apricot, um, but different from other fruits, the levels of citric acid in ume continue to rise as it ripens on the tree. So what will happen in other fruits is that, say, 2 to 4 weeks before maturation, I think, or before it's ready to be picked, sorry, before it's ready to fall naturally, the levels of sugars will increase suddenly, and then the level of citric acid will drop. But ume keeps going up. So when ume is fully ripe, as you found, you can't really eat it raw. There is an ume research station here where scientists play with, various varieties and crossbreeding, and they tried to make a couple varieties for eating raw, and they're just not pleasant. Ume is not meant to be eaten raw. It should be made into salted umeboshi or umeshu liqueur.
Which is surprising, isn't it? Because people often say ume has medicinal qualities, like it helps you fight off food poisoning is one of the things that I read, or it really is good for your digestive tract. But if you eat it raw, it's poison.
Not so good. Yeah.
So good.
Yeah. So medicinal qualities, the two major ones would be a lot of citric acid. And that's easy to overlook because your body produces as much citric acid as it needs to survive. Unlike vitamin C, humans are one of the few animals that don't produce enough vitamins or don't produce any vitamin C with our bodies. We have to get it externally. But it turns out that getting extra citric acid from your foods is really good for you. Citric acid will take care of lactic acid that's been building up in your muscles. It's good for fighting off infection, overcoming fatigue, and that's what samurai carried it into battle because it helped them overcome fatigue, and for other reasons as well.
I talked to someone recently. I can't remember which talk it was, but he was talking about it was Q2. He did a documentary with a martial art teacher, and he was talking about back in the day they used to soak the cords for the sword that would hang down. They would soak it in ume, and
really?
then on their long journeys they would suck on the salty ume flavor, and it would sustain them while they were tired and thirsty. And I thought, wow, what a great story. I love that.
I've never heard that, but yeah, that makes sense. So the salt is said to prevent thirst, which is sort of not what you think would happen, but it promotes saliva production, and apparently it worked for them. It also prevented spoilage in their food. They would mix a dough, I think, with flour and water and umeboshi, and the things would just keep forever because the ume were mixed with them. Oh, and let me just mention the other major health benefit is the polyphenols. There are quite a few researchers at some Wakayama universities studying how ume polyphenols will neutralize viruses. It won't necessarily kill them, but it actually grabs onto them and stops them from moving, which is pretty interesting. My mental image had been that, you eat these things and it sort of zaps the viruses and they're gone. That's not exactly what's happening. It's a little more complicated and interesting.
Wow, that is interesting. I'm showing the picture that you sent me of Wakayama, the beautiful valley. Is that around where the ume farms are, or around where you live?
There are ume in that area, yes. That's not the main producing area. It's about an hour away.
Gorgeous. And Louise has joined from New Zealand. Thanks for joining, Louise. She says hello from New Zealand.
Hi.
So I wonder Wakayama looks like New Zealand. I've always wanted to go to New Zealand. Gorgeous.
Wakayama's mountains, Wakayama's mountains are short but extremely rugged and really tightly packed together.
Gorgeous. Yeah. I'm also showing a map of the ume season. So it starts in early spring, and it's one of my favorite things to see because I know winter is almost over.
Yes. Yeah, it's a harbinger of spring for sure. It's the first flower to bloom in the spring around here. When the honeybees are waking up, it's the first thing that they find. And ume don't produce a lot of nectar, so there's no real ume honey. And also because it's so early in the season, the bees simply use it all for energy. But yeah, it's a nice tie-in.
About the varieties, I was really surprised to learn that there's so many different varieties of ume. You sent me the map with all the different varieties by area. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So, like I said, ume have been cultivated over hundreds of years and improved bit by bit. I think maybe one of the main, most common varieties is called the Shirokaga or the Gojiro. in this area we call it gojiro, but it's found nationwide called shirokaga. And it's also what Japanese immigrants to California smuggled in, apparently sewn into the liner of their jackets. They smuggled in branches which were then grafted onto peach stock, and that's where all of California's ume came from. So California has shirokaga ume because of that. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So the gojiro variety, it doesn't actually, most ume don't ripen as you think a fruit might ripen, where it, it gets nice and orange or red and soft and then falls. Those varieties stay green and hard for a very long time, and then they turn a little yellow, and then they're ready. And if they're turning yellow, they will spoil very quickly. So if you're going to make umeshu out of them, you have to maybe pick and then make it on the same day. And they're also not really suited for umeboshi because they have a higher level of tannins and lower level of natural sugars. So in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, one guy in this area, I should step back just a little bit. Because obviously it's a crop, it was a crop with increasing profitability, there's always these agricultural contests for creating a better variety. So one guy in the early 1900s randomly found a genetic mutation in one of his fields. He had 60 trees of the same variety, and one seed that he planted somehow turned into what is now called the Nanko Ume, which is sort of the premier variety of ume. So that guy held on to that for 30 years because he had a breeder's patent. After 30 years, when the patent expired, a friend of his entered that into one of the local contests for the best ume variety, and it won the contest, and now it's found everywhere. And to avoid that natural genetic mutation that happens when you have cross-pollination creating a new seed, all Nanko ume are created from stock. They're grafted. So they all share the same DNA. And so Nanko ume, the characteristics are it's bigger and softer, and it's a little sweeter and more aromatic, and has a nice kind of reddish color, more so than the other varieties. So because it's bigger, it makes higher quality umeboshi, and a lot of people prefer it for umeshu as well. Although there's a lot of people who say umeshu is already sweet, so we should use the fruit that has higher tannins, the gojiro or shirokaga, to sort of offset the sweetness.
That's really interesting. And when you sent me some of the photos, and I'm showing the one on the tree now, and I was surprised how big they are.
That one tree is exceptionally big. Most are not.
Because the ones that come off my tree are tiny. Maybe it's still a relatively young tree.
If it was a stump, it's probably not relatively young. It might be the opposite. But there's different varieties of ume. There's ones that grow larger, and then there's ko-ume, the very small ones. That are, the kari-kari ume, the tiny little ones that go on your store bento sometimes. That's just a different variety of umeboshi. They're not young. That's just how big they get.
So yeah. Can you tell us about the process a little bit that you experienced when you were working with the company?
Yeah, so production process or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, production process. I was surprised to read that in terms of picking ume, that the farmers usually just put a net under the tree and wait for it to fall. I thought, wow, isn't that great? Like using the natural process to know when it's ripe, it's just going to fall down. I had a friend who taught me about ume, and she was standing on a ladder in my tree, hitting them off with a stick. But it sounds much nicer to put a net underneath. I like that idea.
Well, you could do both, really. You could put the net and then, shake the tree. So can I take 2 steps back?
Of course.
Back to the history a little bit? Okay, so in the 1600s, there was a castle in Tanabe, which is the local town, one of the main ume processing towns now. And the lord of that castle, he was a Tokugawa vassal, and he decreed that people in this area should be able to use the mountains to produce crops tax-free. So a big incentive to put the mountains to work. So Wakayama is very mountainous. There's very little flat ground. So in terms of producing the rice that you had to send to the Tokugawa head office, it was a fairly disadvantaged area. And so that was kind of a big break for the people, and they started using the mountains. Unfortunately, the mountains are made of sort of a slate stone that has it has excellent drainage, which is not good for most crops. But it turns out that it's really good for ume. And that was sort of the birth of the major ume production down here. So a lot of ume is produced on slopes because of that. It's still up there. And so a feature of that is that if you put the net out just the right way, then ume will fall and then all roll down to a collection point. It's really easy. It's also very difficult to climb around the mountains to each tree and pick them by hand. So it's labor saving, and it increases the quality depending on when you're picking it. Yeah.
Awesome. And I read also you sent me about the UNESCO heritage status, and that it's really good for the soil and it stops erosion, and it's good because they they have good forestry around it, so the bees from the forest come and pollinate the ume trees. I thought it was a beautiful story. In reality, is it really is it that sustainable?
Yes and no. If you're going to deforest the mountains and use them for cultivation, then this kind of thing is necessary, because if you just cut the trees, then mountains slide very easily here. So yeah, they developed a system where they plant the ume trees, then of course the weeds grow. So they cut the weeds and just leave them there as compost to increase the sod in the soil to prevent slope slip. At the same time, you need the pollinators, the honeybees in the early spring. And so, beekeeping was developed fairly early here, and people would, carry the hives from field to field. And then they would create ponds in the mountains for irrigation, for water retention. So it is in that sense, it's a sustainable cycle. Of course, the majority of producers use pesticides. The mountains still slip. It's better than not having it at all, but I do wonder if reality is as good as the story.
Well, in terms of social sustainability, it sounds like it's a very important crop and industry for the area. Is it 70 billion yen per year is generated from the ume trade around Japan? And Wakayama employs so many people. Is it 70% of most locals in certain areas are employed by the ume industry? So it's, in that sense, it's very important for the rural economy, right?
It is very important. 70% is probably a little misleading. It is one of it might be the major local agricultural product. Let's see. I think most producers do a good job of keeping their secondary product production in town. So there's cardboard manufacturers in town. There's, plastic pack producers in town. And of course, that means that when you change a product specification, the people can come and consult on changing the packaging very quickly. So that's all very local. Where that 70% might have come from is the harvest season. And that's a little interesting. In the harvest season, it's incredibly busy and everything changes. It's kind of like Christmas in America, not quite as festive, a little more, nose to the grindstone. But everybody's busy with the ume harvest. And so, for example, nobody's going to go buy a new car during harvest season because they're not thinking about that then. And so, well, what do the car dealerships do with their extra people? Well, those people can go and get a part-time job picking ume. And so, historically, the labor has always shifted toward the ume harvest during June and July. And people, discuss who's paying the best, who's providing the best bento at lunchtime, things like this. The farmers used to buy everybody a beer for lunch. They can't do that now. So there's that big shift during the harvest time, and the focus on the local secondary products. It is a very important local crop, and everything is kind of, as much as possible, I think, kept in.
People are busy and making money, so there's a bit bit more enthusiasm around. Even this year, was it going as usual?
Oh, this year was the worst harvest in recent history.
Oh no,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, it's very bad. And I guess we can talk about climate change a little bit later. Um, is there a buzz? There's probably a buzz in some industries. Of course, the farmers, talk about yields, and the ume producing companies talk about price. I would imagine that the only people in a buzz might be the people in the middle, the brokers who buy stock and then try and keep it until the right time to sell for a profit. Everybody else tends to be pretty worried these days, and especially as the producers sort of gain in power and size. Every year smaller companies close down, and it's the larger companies that suck up that demand, and it only strengthens the larger companies, which is not terribly good, I think, overall, for the local economy. But what the larger companies gain in efficiency then is a disadvantage for the farmers, because whether there's a good crop or there's a bad crop, they're always making just barely enough money, I think. The ways for farmers to make more money is for them to process and salt their own fruit. So they soak and salt, and then they sun dry and package that, and then they can sell it to the producers who don't want to do the salting themselves. Of course, you have to have the know-how and the infrastructure to do that.
So is the Umeboshi industry a little bit more like family run? Then the Umeshu industry seems more like a big business model. Is that right?
Yeah, the infrastructure and licensing necessary to do umeshu is very prohibitive, especially the regular tax filings. It's really, you probably have to have at least 3 staff working solely on tracking the movement of alcohol through the factory to give to the tax office. So umeboshi is definitely a more family-oriented product. Yes.
Process, and then we'll talk more
Mm-hmm.
about those. And then immediately washed. Is that right? And could you tell
Mm-hmm.
us the steps?
Yeah, sure. So let's see, at least in our factory, depending on the product being made, it's either purchased immediately. I mean, it's picked from the trees and taken to a local auction house mostly, or to the broker. And then we'd buy from one of those, or directly from a contracted farmer. So it would be washed either on the same day or the next day, and immediately thrown into alcohol, or left to ripen for a day or two, depending on how that particular crate looks. So just to back up a little bit, umeshu is basically, it's a macerated liqueur, so that means it's just soaked, and it's soaked in sugar and alcohol, and the alcohol can be a neutral white spirit like grain alcohol, or it can be a shochu, it can be Japanese sake, nihonshu, brandy, anything with alcohol content can be used. And actually what the alcohol does is it preserves the polyphenols and other things that the sugar pulls out via osmotic pressure. And that's why umeshu has to be sweet. And also because there's so much citric acid and sometimes tannins in the ume that the sugar needs to counteract or balance.
Yeah, I thought
So
that was
usually
really
the producers.
interesting how it's not only white liquor. When you
Hmm,
make it at home, everybody always tells me just use the white liquor, but it can also
yeah,
be used with sake and shochu and brandy. It's really
yeah,
exciting. Yeah, so you have more varieties, especially if you're making your own. A bit more freedom, maybe.
yes, yeah, yeah. The white liqueur will give you the most foolproof product, but it's fun to play around with other varieties as well. Yeah. So what most producers do is they will, they'll have these gigantic tanks, and they'll bring in whatever alcohol they're using, and then they'll bring in usually a liquid sugar. Unfortunately, it's mostly what people use here is not high fructose corn syrup, but it would be sort of like a low fructose corn syrup. I mean, high fructose corn syrup means you're taking corn and turning it into glucose, and then adding fructose into that. And so high fructose just means you're adding a lot of fructose. And so mostly what's used here is a low fructose corn syrup. If you're making it at home, I would definitely recommend using the rock sugar sold in Japan, or if you can't access that, use a granulated white sugar or even a brown sugar if you like. Much better than a liquid sugar, I think.
I saw there are some varieties where they use the black sugar from Okinawa. That's nice.
Yeah.
Nice variety.
Yeah.
I'd like to try that.
It's really good. You wouldn't use 100% black sugar. You would have that be 1/6 to 1/5 of your ratio or so. Yeah. So yeah, you mix your alcohol and your sugar and you throw the ume in and you just let it sit there for a few months, mixing it occasionally.
A comment from Frass. Thanks for joining from YouTube. He says, I tasted homemade umezake. I think the name was from my principal in Fukushima. It was awesome.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah, the homemade is always the best, I think. What's sold tends to be very sweet, at least for my taste. What people make at home is often a lot sharper and less sweet, which I like.
So when you make it at home, you said you have one next to you. Is that something you made this year?
So this is something I made last summer, and this is made from, trying to get the light angle just right here. This is made from the Gojiro ume that I said doesn't ripen so much, but when it does ripen, it gets just a little bit of blush to it. But then the sugars will, I guess, caramelize might be the best word, over time, and the color gets a little richer.
Awesome.
Common wisdom says that you should use 1 kilo of ume to 1 kilo of sugar, and then issho, which is 1.8 liters of alcohol. But I usually use 3 kilos of ume to 3 kilos of ume to 600. Go, nice.
So this is my jar. I've been, because I have kids, I've been making ume juice.
Nice.
And it's not my ume because these are store-bought. These are from somebody local, but much bigger than the ones that come off our tree. But if I make the ume juice, and then I can also add it with shochu or something else later,
Yes. Yeah, absolutely possible. Yeah, like a chuhai kind of thing.
Yeah, I like that. But you can basically keep it for a very long time. Is that right?
Oh yeah, I have some in my closet that is probably now like 15 years old.
Wow, aged.
Yeah.
And I saw some of the website you sent me as well. They have some aged or cask certain umeshus. Is that right? So different varieties.
Yeah. Barrel aged, so using like a Scotch or a brandy barrel, and then aging the umeshu in that. Umeshu it's a pretty one-dimensional drink. Because it's macerated, there's not a lot that you can add into the soak, because it would take a lot of extra effort to maintain properly. So mostly what people do is they take the umeshu that's created by the soak and they just mix it with things. And so for the producers, there's kind of a limited number of things you can mix with it to make a good product. And so just, in order to expand their product lineup, they've started barrel aging, which produces a really nice umeshu. My former company had 1, 5, and 10-year-old barrel aged ones, and the 10 was just sort of another thing entirely. It was pretty amazing.
Quite high alcohol content, right? It says, I'm showing it now, taro barrel aged umeshu 20%, cask strength 20%. So what do you usually cut it with, or what do you soften it with? How should I say that? I'd say the majority. Sparkling water is nice.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. The majority of umeshu available on the market is probably 12 to 13%. The stuff blended with fruit juice, pre-blended, would be like around the 5 to 8%. And then, like you said, the stronger ones would be around the 18 to 20%. So yeah, if you cut them, water is fine. Soda is great. A fruit juice that mixes well, you wouldn't want to overpower it. Let's see what else. It's also good, actually. It's not terribly intuitive, but to mix it with another alcohol and then dilute that. So you could mix umeshu with like a shochu that has a nice flavor that matches with it, and then dilute that with soda or water. And then that would cut your sweetness a little bit too.
I saw that they had umeshu and shiso, because
Mm,
umeboshi goes so nicely with shiso. It was interesting to
yeah.
see a cocktail made with shiso and umeshu, and other
Yeah.
things. Yeah, nice.
Was that on the website that I sent you?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that was developed by this really wonderful Japanese bartender who lives in New York. She made some recipes for us. That's a fun one. Yeah. Umeshu, I guess, should we talk about like foreign markets, especially America?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. It hasn't had its day in the sun yet. I'm kind of wondering if that day is coming. The niche so far for umeshu has been Japanese supermarkets, which of course makes a lot of sense. But those sweet drinks don't really have a good place in American, alcohol culture at this point. Um, if you show a European an umeshu for the first time, they might ask like, "Oh, should I drink this before or after a meal?" But in America, that doesn't really exist. I did hear that there was an umeshu bar opening in New York, but that was pre-pandemic, and I haven't really found any traces of that rumor recently. Yeah.
Fras has said, "How was the 20% one?" And wow, 15 years, best friend in the making. He's coming to your house.
I just got a little bit left of that one, but I'll share it with you.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
My former company had two 20% products, and one was the barrel aged, and one was a non-barrel aged. It was just aged in steel tanks for a year. And they're quite different. It's fun to taste the difference. But at the 20%, the sugar content is also very rich. So it's going to be syrupy. So you'll want to cut it with something or mix it with something.
I grew up in Hawaii eating umeboshi,
Mm,
in my onigiri or musubi. Should we talk a little bit about the umeboshi industry, the side of it?
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So the umeboshi actually account for probably 90 to 95% of the income derived from ume. Umeshu is a pretty small portion of that. In America and probably in other countries, umeshu is sort of like the strange stepchild of Japanese sake. But in Japan, it's just another drink on the shelf. It is totally unrelated to sake. And it is quite sweet. And because of that, I think the market is a little small. So ume producers will make most of their money with umeboshi. So the process for umeboshi, like I said, the farmers might take the fresh ume, wash and sort by size, and then soak in salt. Or the producers might buy fresh. And then after they've soaked for, say, let's see, at least 2 weeks in 20% salt, you remove them from the salt and you lay them out on like a slotted tray and set them out in the summer sun to dry. And then you have to go, back in the old days, you had to go and you had to turn each one by hand 1 to 3 times every day in the hot summer sun. But then they realized if you put a non-stick sheet down, then you can use it. It looks like a rake with a long stick under it. And if you push the rake under that sheet just the right way, the ume will all flip over for you. So it's gotten a little bit easier, but it's still, hot work.
Yeah, too bad we don't have
So,
any pictures of that, but you're describing it so beautifully. I can imagine it. And I was really surprised, to read that it's still done by hand mostly, and
mhm,
it's done in summer. So it's just you
mhm.
must have areas where they just have loads of ume drying in the sun all over the place. That's
Oh yeah,
amazing.
I mean, you drive down the road and there's people's racks out, and it is very labor intensive. You have to turn these things over, even if you're using a rake. You've got to do it by hand 1 to 3 times per tray per day, and then usually you bring the trays in at night. It is very labor intensive, and I guess more in the labor intensive in just a bit. But yeah, so then the producing companies will buy those sun dried ume from the farmers, and then they're 20% salt, so they keep forever. My former company had a couple umeboshi more than 100 years old on display, and it's mostly just like a clump of salt, but you could eat it. I guess the president tried eating one time, and it was still umeboshi. um,
Yeah.
But yeah, so they keep for 1 to 2. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. My son and our babysitter tried making umeboshi one time, and it was basically pure salt. What
Mm.
I had tried, and I thought maybe we just keep it a bit longer. And the babysitter's like, yeah, you can keep it for 20 years, then maybe it'd be good. She was so kind.
Mm. That's funny. Yeah. Umeboshi are
20%
generally
salt
pickled.
though. That's pretty
Yeah,
high, and that's normal, huh?
it's very high. It's normal. So then what happens inside the umeboshi factory is that you take these tubs of ume that have been sitting there, packed in their own juices. They're very tightly packed together. So you put it through a machine that sort of vibrates it apart and then washes it with some air bubbles and water jets. Um, and then people will pick through it to take out any ones that aren't to spec. And then they go in a desalinization solution that's usually at it's much hotter than bath temperature to take out the salt to whatever spec you need for that product. So the finished product will be anywhere from 20% if you're just taking it as is, down to 12 to 3% for most of the ones on the store shelves.
And then it's usually it's not just salt, right? It's usually packed with, is it shiso or certain
Um,
leaves?
Traditionally, yeah. So what you do is, you'd have these suppliers, back when there were lots of small shops everywhere. You could just go to the shop and buy a small bit of umeboshi. They'd all be 20% because nobody was a flavored ume producer in that time. So everybody would have a crock in their kitchen of liquid for soaking ume. And because it's sitting in your kitchen during the rainy season and all these, bad seasons with lots of mold, it's got to be fairly antimicrobial. And so the citric acid from the ume does a good job, but also red shiso, because of the polyphenols, is also very antimicrobial. And so that was one of the very common mixes people had. They'd go and buy the 20%, stick it in their crock. It would lose some of the salt, take on some of the shiso flavor and color. And that's where the shiso flavor umeboshi came from. Yeah.
In summertime, my favorite drink is red shiso juice.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever had
Yes,
that?
that's the
Oh, it's
best, isn't it?
so
I make it every year.
refreshing.
Yeah, it's the
Amazing.
best.
But it's really
Yeah.
hard to find red shiso, I find, in
Mm,
our area. Maybe it's easier
okay.
where you are.
It's pretty common here, maybe because of the ume. Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah, we can get it for like $1 for a big, 2-liter bottles worth of shiso juice.
And
Yeah.
how is umeboshi as an export?
Mm. There's not much market for it,
No.
as you might imagine. Um, some people in America, I mean, okay, where umeboshi as is succeeding is of course in the Japanese markets, mostly say California, New York, and other major like Seattle, Portland. The quantity is fairly low, and to be honest, unfortunately, I wouldn't be surprised in the next 5 to 10 years if a lot of the current products weren't able to be imported because the FDA is getting more strict with production methods for foods, not just from Japan, but worldwide. Um, Kind of an interesting thing here is that umeboshi is considered a food that doesn't spoil easily. And so within Japan, the restrictions on production methods are fairly lax, and it doesn't jive with what the FDA or European importers require. That said, I don't know. Some farmers in America have been salting plums, not ume, but plums, and finding a market for those. Of course, they're organic because it sort of has to be in America these days. Um, I believe there is a place in America for some ume product. The difficulty is, would that be profitable for the producer? And that's really the hard spot. You can't import frozen ume, I think, because of the seeds. You can't import ume puree because it's very cost prohibitive. So Umeshu and Umeboshi right now are the only two products. Oh, freeze dry also doesn't really work because of quality issues and production cost. So Umeshu and Umeboshi are the only two ume products right now that really can make the trip from Japan. And it's kind of an unfortunate situation. But hopefully, something will change eventually. And I don't know.
Yeah.
I
I'd
think
like
one
to
way to
see more possibilities. It sounds like a kind of product, the whole ume industry sounds like something that could be very sustainable. It kind of reminds me in a way of indigo, right? The Japanese
mm,
indigo. How if
yeah,
you do have indigo in its natural sense, the way it's grown, the way it's harvested, the way it's used, the way it's disposed of, could
mm,
all be very natural.
mm,
And maybe ume is very
yeah.
similar. Our modern conveniences has added pesticides and things to make it less natural, but it seems like it has potential to go back to more natural ways. Do you have that feeling after working in the industry?
I do. I think Ume really suffers from Japan's passion for packaged and beautiful foods. Ume's skin is very delicate and is very susceptible to molds and other things that float around in the rainy season. So that's why they use mostly the not pesticides, but the stuff to keep the mold off, and then of course insecticides as well to a certain extent. Um, if a, if an Ume product that wasn't so great looking was accepted by Japanese consumers, I think it would be a wonderful thing for the industry as a whole. Um,
The whole
it's a little
ugly
frustrating.
fruit, ugly vegetable acceptance
Yeah.
in general, that would be a
Mm,
huge win if we could just accept
yes.
that. And maybe
Yes.
start with discounts. Like just start
Yeah.
seeing it in the stores would be a big step, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There is one company. It's called Ryujin Ume, Ryujin Ume, and they're up in the mountains here. And there's a lot of organic producers or organic growers up in the mountains. And then Ryujin Ume is one of the main um, shops that buys the raw ume and salts them up there. I think the climate is different enough that organic is easier to do up there. It is, to be honest, to be fair, it's quite difficult down here where it's just so humid in the rainy season. Um, but yeah, like you said, the whole acceptance of ugly fruit. Um, every year, people talk about the honeybees and how they are declining here, and there's sort of a collective shrug of the shoulders, like, oh, if only we knew what to do about it. It's really frustrating.
Yeah. I interviewed a bee farmer, honey bee farmer in
Mm,
Miyajima Island, and
okay.
he actually comes from a biology background, and he was
Ooh,
working for a big company, and he became disillusioned, and he wanted to do something that would help society and nature and make a living, so he decided to be a bee farmer. And
mm,
it's a great story, but he was saying, similar to what you just said, it's so frustrating that people say
mm,
they don't know why problems are happening. If anybody
mm,
knows biology or looks at what's happening in nature and what used to happen in grandma's
yeah,
time, we know why things are going wrong, right? And we need to
yeah,
stop putting things in the ground that we don't want to put in our bodies.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the local town's population over the last 10 years has dropped from 70 to 60,000 people. And I used to know the number of ume farmers, but it's also dropped probably a little more steeply because, of course, ume farmers tend to be of a higher average age. Um, so, I mean, that's definitely something. I'd say more than more than the honeybees, unfortunately. That's something that the producing companies are very concerned about, and they're thinking about all sorts of ways to maintain production numbers. And even though it's up in the mountains, a certain amount of automation can be introduced. Um, I don't have any specific knowledge in this area, but my hunch is that unfortunately, pesticide spraying is something that can easily be adapted to automation, more than harvesting, probably more than say pruning the trees. So that might be one of the low-hanging fruits, if you will, uh, that'll get taken up by robotics.
It's a
Kind
shame
of,
because it seems
yeah.
like you said, most of the trees are on slopes, so you can
Hmm.
put nets underneath and everything will roll
Right,
down beautifully, and
right,
it doesn't seem like you need that much automation. It would be great to
right,
see natural know-how and human ingenuity at work, and
right.
because if you had an organic product, you could charge more. You could appeal more to inbound visitors, right? I mean, there's a lot of wonderful knock-on effects. One of the things I came across were the Ume areas has such beautiful, pristine water, soft water. This is very similar in Hiroshima. We have soft water. That's why sake is so wonderful in Hiroshima. But if you're putting pesticides in the ground, that's not good for your purity of water. You know, that affects everything. So let's I know it's so hard. But I always think, well, what were you doing 20 years ago? What was the previous method before this one? You know, can we go back to that?
Yeah. There's kind of one more interesting thing along those lines, and that's the flavoring liquid. That's always been a big problem. Flavoring liquid is very high in citric acid, salt, and sugar, as well as, you know, some other stuff. But those are the main three. And so, of course, it's illegal to dump that in the river or the ocean. That hasn't always stopped people, but I think they're pretty good about not letting people do that. So when you drive around, you'll see these tanks, you know, these 1-ton tanks full of, you know, waste liquid that is just sitting there. So actually, locally, a methane-driven electricity generating station was developed and built, where people could take their leftover liquid, and, you know, bacteria would break it down, methane would be given off, and it drives, you know, these turbines to produce electricity. One of the things that happens with that is it was built near a river, and then the cooling water was taken in by the river and then planned to be routed back into the river. And as you probably know, anything discharged by a house or by a factory historically has been regulated by a certain element of society that has some political sway. And unfortunately, that factory is not really doing what it's supposed to be doing right now because of those political problems. So that's another sort of obstacle to progress.
Frustrating. I mean, you're originally from Portland. Do you communicate with people back there, or how do things in Japan in terms of sustainability or ume or industry that you've been involved with? How would you say Japan's doing? Are we just a little bit behind the curve? Is how I'm feeling compared to other areas of the world?
Yeah, well, I mean, you'd have a much better grasp on that than I would. But, you know, Wakayama, you know, we're 2 hours south of Osaka, but, you know, Okayama is 2 hours away from Osaka, but it's extremely different. You know, it's on the main route down to where you are, and we're like off in that corner. It's extremely provincial here. And I can't really speak to what's happening in Osaka and Tokyo or Hiroshima, but out here, the level of awareness is just so low. I mean, people do what's faddy. You know, they buy the reusable shopping bags, but I'm not sure there's a level of awareness as to why that's important. And when it comes to industry, I mean, you know, it's probably true everywhere. You know, profits trump everything. In places like America and Europe, probably, you know, company image will help profits. That's not true here, at least in the Ume industry. My former company, I believe, has not developed SDGs yet. And if they haven't, then nobody in the industry has, is my guess. Yeah.
When I do consulting with rural destinations, and I try to be positive, and I try to give my positive spin on sustainability, and it's great branding, and, you know, if you start doing this, it's going to be more appealing to inbound visitors and even domestic visitors, you know, and they just, it's exactly what you say. They just can't see past just thinking about costs and profits. And even thinking of surviving this year because margins are so low, it's really scary to think about changing things so radically, right? So small steps. I always recommend small steps.
Small steps for sure. And I think, maybe we have to figure out like a strategy. And I'm sure you've thought about this. I haven't really yet, but the consensus building model in Japan really keeps things as the status quo. If just one person says like mendokusai, then the entire project is likely to fail. So we got to figure out like how to get that wedge in there where they're not going to say that, or even if they do say that, we can continue, progressing with the idea.
You need a leader with a vision. You need somebody who's on the inside of the group who's enthusiastic about change and who can see the benefits of it down the road. And then they can infect the group. And even if that person kind of has power, even if somebody in that group might say mendokusai or I don't want to do it, it can still happen, right? But you need that enthusiastic person, to really make it happen.
Definitely.
Yeah. Any other history things or import-export things or something we haven't touched on yet? We've got another 9 minutes.
Yeah, well, let's see. I talked about the recent history and the longer history. You asked about Honkaku Umeshu. So it's a recent designation that labels like what an authentic umeshu is. Like, for example, in the shochu world, there's Honkaku shochu, and you won't find Honkaku shochu for less than 1,000 yen per 720 milliliter bottle, because it's made with higher quality ingredients. You're not allowed to blend that with cutting alcohol or things like that. So for Honkaku Umeshu, I believe the only ingredients allowed are ume, sugar, and alcohol. Is that right? Oh, and of course water. So in other non-Honkaku Umeshus, things you might find are brandy, additional cutting alcohol, ume flavor, peach flavor. I mean, there's all sorts of things. If you're in Japan, you can look for Choya's little box. It's called Sarari. It's about this big. I don't mean to like bag on anybody. Choya's got a bunch of great products too. And I mean, every producer has to have a product, at the bottom of the price range. But if you read the ingredient list for that, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. I taste tested it. It's not my thing, but it's not bad. For what they've done with it is not terrible. If you want a Choya umeshu, they're 1 year and 3 year bottles. If you look in the bottle and it's kind of a yellowish color, and it says Honkaku Umeshu on it, and it's not more than like $15, I'd say that's probably a good deal. Choya's got a couple really good ones on the market right now. The Taru 1 year cask, aged by Nakata Foods, it is also a pretty good one. It's going to be about $20-$25, but it's good.
That's great. And one thing I love, I'm showing the lineup right now. You've got aka umeshu, so the red umeshu. You've got honey and royal jelly umeshu. So you've got lots of different ingredients, and some of them sound really good, but it's like you said, you have to read the label. But I'm really happy to see all of them in bottles, not plastic. They're in glass bottles. And that's one problem with umeboshi is most of it is only plastic packaging. It's really hard to find recyclable packaging for umeboshi, right?
Yeah, very. I mean, it's it's got a high liquid content, so there's kind of not much you can do. Yeah, it's very
jars.
Difficult.
I would prefer jars. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's plastic. It's the modern convenience, right?
The organic product I mentioned from America, of course, they sell in jars, but again, cost.
Yeah. So some of the, like your company, you sent me the umeshu with whole fruit inside, the 12%.
Oh, okay.
That's a classic, right?
I'm glad you brought that up. That was on my list of things to talk about. So when you make umeshu, there's no fruit in there. The osmotic pressure of the sugar draws out everything from the fruit that it can in about 4 to 5 months. And then after about 8 months, depending on the variety of ume you use and the amount of sugar, etc., the extract from the seed will begin to leach out. So if you buy, for example, 2 umeshus, like one just regular non-flavored 12% in like a wine-shaped bottle, and then you buy the one you're talking about with the fruit in it, if you taste test those next to each other, the one with the fruit will not have as good of a flavor. The umeshu with the fruit will taste like the fruit. Of course, we've all eaten that umeshu ume. It's fun, it's like a Jello shot or something. You can chop it up and put it on ice cream or in a cake or something. It's pretty good. But you're really negatively affecting the flavor of the umeshu by leaving it in for too long. So if you make it at home, also I recommend taking out the ume in 6 months, and then you can just age your umeshu for as long as you like without the ume.
That is a really good tip. I have this Ume Juice that I made last summer, so it's time to take them out now.
Oh, probably. Yeah.
Wow, good tip. Yeah. So even the one that you've aged over time, you've taken out the fruit.
Definitely. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Good tip. I'm going to have to do that.
Yeah.
Because for some reason I was thinking the longer you leave the fruit in, the better the flavor, but that's not necessarily true.
I thought that in the beginning also. And I left the fruit in for a long time without too much negative, without any problems. But I did get a batch of ume 2 years ago it was really strange. I got the same ume from a friend that I collect from every year, and I made the umeshu in the same way. And for some reason, it had this, what's the pronunciation of vitamin B17, ianthocyanin or something like that. It's a poison that some new age people think also is a cancer cure in small doses. And that's what's in the pit, just like a peach pit. If you make the peach jam, you put the pit of the seed in there as a preservative, right? But you don't eat it. Well, it's the same thing in ume. For some reason, in that batch of ume that I got from my friend, all of that flavor came out, and I had to toss the whole batch.
Oh, no.
I don't know what it was.
So when you're making it yourself, you would wash the fruit. You can buy these bags of fruit in most stores around Japan. In your area, you must be having amazing offers in all the local shops, right? And then you wash it and take the pits out before you soak it in alcohol?
No.
Or you leave the pit?
No. So some people are very fastidious about removing the stems, but just, if you tweak off whatever leftover wood is on there and make sure there's no spider webs, that's good enough. Give it a quick rinse and throw it in.
But you leave the seed in. Oh, the stem. That's what I was thinking. So it doesn't matter if you take the stem out or not?
It's better to remove any extra wood that's on there, but after you remove the stem, there's a little a little divot of woody material left in there. You don't have to worry about that.
And then, so it's washed, you put it in these beautiful glass jars like I'm showing, and you put the rock sugar?
Rock sugar. Yeah. Yeah, layer it in. Put a little bit of sugar, first layer of ume, a little more sugar, and keep layering until you're done. And then pour your alcohol over the top to cover.
And then as long as the liquid covers, then you're good to go and keep it?
You're good to go, but you should know your ratio of sugar to liquid. Because if it just covers, but you don't know how much you put in, then you may have a high sugar to liquid ratio. My favorite ratio to use is 2 kilos of ume and 3.6 liters of alcohol at 35% and 600 grams of sugar.
Wow.
And so I found that very low sugar, very, very low.
Yeah.
So I found that 600 grams of sugar will pull out everything from the ume, and then you can balance it as you like. You can add more sugar later if it's too sharp for you.
That sounds great.
But adding more sugar doesn't increase your draw from the ume. So it's a good starting point.
What is the benefit of having the rock sugar versus like brown sugar or other kinds?
Yeah. Brown sugar is a great flavor addition. But with a granulated sugar, or especially liquid sugar, you're increasing the density of the liquid. So when you dump the ume in, they're going to float. And then you're going to have mold problems on top. You have to figure out a way to keep them down. So rock sugar dissolves fairly slowly as it's drawing things out from the ume, and it'll help them stay under the liquid level.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Great. Great tips there. And we didn't have many questions, but I hope people next spring, once all the ume is available in the stores, people will try your recipe. I'm going to have to write that down. You're very specific. Now, this is years
Yes.
and years of practice, right?
I have sort of honed my recipe, to be honest. I work on it a little every year.
That's wonderful.
I enjoy my umeshu a little less every year. As I get older, it just gets too sweet. But I do enjoy still working on the recipe. So.
And the kind of alcohol you like using best is the white
I
alcohol?
use the white liqueur, the white alcohol. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna try it with shochu next time. How exciting!
Okay. Yeah.
like a home. Well, I can do that with the ume juice and the shochu and make a homemade chuhai because I spent 3 years in Kyushu, so I feel an affinity to chuhai.
Nice. Yeah.
Well, thank you
I only
so
do the
much.
white.
Yeah.
Are we at time?
No,
We
go
are at
ahead.
time. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, well, I only do the white liquor, but sometimes I do add the black sugar and things like that you mentioned. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, it seems like the Okinawan black sugar would work really well because it would dissolve slowly over time, similar to the rock sugar, maybe.
Yeah, it adds a really nice note. Yeah, richness.
Nice. Yeah. I'll have to try that too. Thank you so much, Todd. That was great having you.
And it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Your insights in the ume industry. And I know you've got some secret projects that you're kind of developing right now. So maybe in a few months you can come back and tell us about those.
That would be wonderful.
That'd be great. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining today. And tomorrow, 9 a.m., we're talking about coding. A little bit different from talking about umeshu, but also very interesting and important for a community. We're talking to Jan Fan, who started Code Chrysalis. So that'll be 9 a.m. tomorrow, Japan time. And then next Monday is a national holiday in Japan, but we're doing our first ever workshop. So if you're interested in learning how to make farm-to-table, easy ingredients from the local supermarket and great Mexican food, then please sign up for our workshop. You can see that on inboundambassador.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks so much, Todd. Thanks for all your insights. Everybody have a great night, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.